A little bit about perfect layers. So let's start with what is perfect layers. Well, it's a layered workflow solution that currently works in Lightroom. It works as a standalone product, so if you don't have Lightroom, you can just use perfect layers as a normal product and send your images into it. And support for aperture is coming. You can also access some of the most useful layer tools. That's what we built perfect layers around, such as blending exposures, creating intriguing composites from several images, and also masking elements from different photos straight from Lightroom. Now, this is something that, especially since we just released perfect layers, we're starting to understand. People are asking, why perfect layers? Why should we choose perfect layers? Well, the first bullet is one of the driving reasons why perfect layers was built in the first place. Photographers love Lightroom. It's definitely one of the strongest image management products out there. It has an extremely powerful set of editing tools. And to that point, the reason why I feel confident saying that photographers love Lightroom is because we hear it all the time. I hear it whenever we go to trade shows. Photographers say, I do all of my work in Lightroom, or I don't want to leave Lightroom. I want to do as much as I can in Lightroom. Whatever you can do to speed up your workflow. I want to take images. Right now in Lightroom, you simply can't do things like layer blending, masking. It just doesn't work. Lightroom is a single exposure editing platform. So you can only work on one image at a time, which is why Lightroom has support for plugins, and that's where Perfect Layers comes in, is that you can take multiple images now, what you could never do before, or you had to use Photoshop for, to do things like blending and masking, to get take multiple images and create a new creative image out of it. And also, we bring some cool things to the table, like live layer blending previews. So we have blending modes that we're going to show you. And unlike some other products, as you hover over these blending modes, you'll actually see live previews, which is huge. And also, we have a very funky trim tool. I love this tool, and I'll show you how to use it as well. Now, some of the finer points about the Perfect Layers public preview release, and I want to stress the subtitle public preview release. Not all of the features that we have planned for the shipping version are included right now. This is kind of, if you want to think of it, it's akin to a beta program. It's free for everyone to download and use. You can use it again within Lightroom or as a standalone product. But we will be introducing some more very cool options and performance boosts in the final release. Now, there may be some bugs and instabilities that haven't been ironed out yet. It happens to me, it happens to the best of us, and that's okay. We want to hear about that. Within Lightroom, or rather within Perfect Layers, there is a feedback submission option, and I'll show you where it is. We want to hear from you. I know Dan definitely wants to hear from you. If you have any feedback, if something crashed or you're not sure about something, we want to hear from you. So, without further ado, what I'd like to do is jump into Lightroom here, and I'm going to start with this first image. Now, I have this image here. I took this image last summer at Acadia National Park in Maine. I had a 10-stop neutral density filter on, and I did that because I wanted to give the image somewhat of a painterly feel. Now, as you can see, the image itself, the sky is kind of bland, and so there isn't much of a differentiation between the horizon. You've got your rock foreground, some water and some sky. So what I want to do is I want to augment that painterly look. I want to kind of enhance it. I want to supplement it. Now, I don't know how many of you really use textures, and if you're not a Photoshop user, you probably don't, because previously, without Photoshop, you couldn't take these kind of texture files. These are just sample texture files. You can get these anywhere. You can take your own. I'm a big fan of taking my own textures. If I ever walk past a certain wall or a surface and I have my camera or even my camera phone, I just snap a shot of it and there you go, there's a texture. So what I do when I practice texture blending is I look for a texture that kind of matches the overall color theme and design of the shot. So here we've got some relative earth tones, a little bit of cool tone. I feel that this texture here will work nicely. So what I can do within Lightroom is I can select this image and the texture image and my actual image itself. I'll go to File, Plugin Extras, and I'll select Perfect Layers. Now, I want to make a little point here. When you're new to Perfect Layers, the first time you launch it, you'll get this public preview screen, this welcome screen. Definitely go through these slides that we built for you because they're there's a ton of useful information. And when you're done or you don't want to see this pop up, just deselect this little checkbox that says Show at Launch. So here we are in perfect layers. Now, what I'm going to do here is I've got my image on one layer, and I've got the texture on another layer. So what I'm going to do, what I like to do personally, is I like to rename my layers by double-clicking on the title, and I'm going to say Acadia. I'm going to hide it, and then here I'm going to type texture. Cool. So we've got these here. I can reorder it. I can put the texture on top if I wanted to, but because the Acadia image is smaller, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go here. I'm going to drop the opacity of the image. And now I can take my texture layer, go to my resize tool. I just zoomed out a bit, and I'm just going to resize it. Or you know what? Because we have the transparency behind it, let me just fill it up. And instead of resizing texture, I'll resize the image itself to fit. And I like the semi-transparent aspect of it because it shows me where the end of the texture is. Now, what I can do is I'm going to bring my opacity back up so I see the image. I'm going to scroll through. Let me just turn that off. I'm going to scroll through my blending modes. Now, this is one of the features that I love about perfect layers. As I hover over these, I get a live preview. Now, as I scroll through, I'm like, oh, you know what? What I'm doing is I'm paying attention to what effects the texture is having with the blending mode. But here's an important point. Don't just stop at this layer. So I like overlay, actually. I like what it's doing to the sky. But I want to make a point that you want to go through all of the blending modes. We've got these cool blending modes. And now that I think about it, I was on overlay. If I stopped here, I'd be happy. But once I got to hard light, I'm actually much happier with hard light. The other thing that I notice is that hard light does a better job. I like what hard light's doing to the sky and to the water, but I like what overlay is doing to the rock. So watch what we can do. I'm going to select hard light, and now I'm going to put my texture on top. I'm going to go back to my blending mode to hard light. I'm going to put my image here, and I'm going to send it to normal just so that we have the proper order and blending modes. I'm going to select my masking brush. Now the masking brush allows you to show or hide certain parts of the active layer. So what I want to do is I'm just going to select paint out as my mode. I'll bring my feather up a bit. I'll increase my brush size. You can use the same shortcut keys as you would find in Photoshop. And now what I'm free to do is just paint out the effect. So when I do my texture webinars on our webinar program, one of the kind of lessons that I like to convey for textures is you want to be methodical. The best uses of textures are when it's kind of thought out. So here, I'm liking what the texture is doing to the sky, and you see how I'm removing it from the rock with ease, something that you could never do previously just using Lightroom. So if you paint out, you can see how I'm painting out over here. The texture, it doesn't match up. Just change your mode from paint out to paint in. You can adjust your brush size and just kind of clean that up a bit and clean it up over here. So I've removed the texture. But now I remembered that I liked what one of the other blending modes did to the rock. So I can copy that layer. And I can go back and start adjusting here. I'm finding a blending mode that I like. So what I can do here is I can do the exact opposite. Now I can paint out the effect from the sky. And this might take a little bit longer, but that's okay, just because it's a larger space. So I'm just kind of doing these broad strokes, and I'm revealing the original texture from that second layer. But look at how you're getting this really nice kind of painterly feel. And there's one more point I want to make. Let's say this is too much for you. This is like, whoa, this is way, way strong. We can go back down to the second layer. I can drop the opacity down. So I can cut into that a little bit if I don't want that much of a presence for my texture. And I can do the same thing with the layer above it if I want. So this is kind of, these are the ways that you can use perfect layers. We can kind of get rid of these strips here.
Hey Brian, I was going to mention you could actually hit the reset mask button as well, and it'll just reset the mask on that layer copy that you made. Whenever you copy a layer, it copies that layer exactly. So it copies the layer mask that was on it as well as its blending mode and its opacity. But if
Yep.
you just wanted to remove that from that layer, you could just hit reset, and then you
Yep.
could start painting the texture in on the rocks instead.
That's exactly right. Let's say it's the reset mask is also a really cool way of just kind of doing an undo or flattening out the mask, just like Dan mentioned. So if you want, you can undo that. You can again preview the different blending modes that you have. Let's say you want to start over, find one that you like. So I did like what color was doing to the rocks as well. And here, all you need to do, just like before, is paint out. And we have make sure you're at 100% opacity if you want to remove that entire effect. So I'm not going to spend the time, just really quickly, I'm just going to quickly make these broad strokes, but you can see the various options. So it gives you a lot of different combinations. If you were to take these combinations of different layers, duplicate layers, and then apply different blending modes, you really can get a very unique look. Because watch, let's turn this layer off and that layer off, and here's our original image. And just with a simple texture, we applied some blending modes, and then we duplicated the texture and applied another blending mode. We were able to get what I consider to be a very kind of painterly shot. You still have the really nice characteristics of that long exposure, but you're also able to infuse some creativity. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to close out of here. I could hit save. That's actually a good point to make. I could hit save to update the PSD file that's created. When you send your images from Lightroom to Perfect Layers, a PSD file is created. And by having this PSD file, if you want to make some finer edits in Photoshop, like using some of the filters that they have, you can send it over. But let's say you also want to save a TIFF or a JPEG. You can also go to export here, and when you select export, it'll give you the option of selecting a JPEG or TIFF. You'll notice now that we have the image in Lightroom. So if I want, I can go to my develop module and continue on. Let's say I want to boost the contrast and bring a little bit of fill light and some clarity, which is one of my favorite tools in Lightroom. I can do that very easily. All right, what I'm going to do now is pass it over control to my colleague Dan, and he's going to show you some examples as well of how he uses perfect layers. So Dan, I'm going to pass over right now.
Okay.
Okay. There you go.
There we go. Is that the right screen showing? And I'm just going to check my microphone level so it doesn't reset.
You're good to go.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to actually show you how to do what I kind of call poor man's HDR or budget HDR. This is, everybody knows that Mr. Matiash is the master of HDR. I'm going to show you what us old school photographers used to have to do before this fancy HDR software came around. I'm going to use it to do a sky replacement. Now, a lot of times when you're blending images together, you really only need two exposures, one for the foreground and one for the background, or in this case, one for the foreground and one for the sky. So with this image, this was photographed in Maui, I've got one version where I photographed and I have the proper exposure for the water and for the rocks in the foreground, but obviously the sky is too bright, it gets overexposed. So then I just took a second exposure where I get the sky the way that I wanted, but obviously the foreground is too dark. We're just going to blend these two together in perfect layers, and we can actually get one shot where we get the best of both of those together. So I'm just going to select both of those files here inside of Lightroom. I'll go up to the Plugin Extras menu and send it to Perfect Layers. It's going to take those two files. It's going to obviously merge those two together as two layers. Let me make this a little bit larger so we can see. And I'm going to go over here to our layers palette on the right-hand side. So on the bottom, there's our layer with the water. I'm just going to rename that layer water so I can keep track of it. And on top of it, there's the layer for the sky. Again, I'm just going to rename that one sky so it's easier to keep track of. Now, all we have to do is just hide the foreground on this upper layer. We just want to hide the water that's too dark. So an easy way to do that, again, is just to use that handy masking brush tool right here. I'm going to make my brush size a little bit larger. I'm going to reduce my feather a bit here because I want a large brush with just a small, soft edge to it. going to make sure I'm set to paint out. And I'm actually going to bring my opacity back down to about 50%. The reason I want to do this, I want to be able to kind of slowly brush this away because maybe I want a little bit of a blend of the two. I actually want all the dark sky, but I don't want all of the light in the water. Maybe I thought it was a little too light. So watch. Now all I do is I just click, and as I start to brush, it's going to paint away that upper layer and reveal the layer underneath. As long as I keep my mouse held down doing this brush stroke, it's going to keep the exact same opacity in the mask, even if I overlap over the top of it. Just like that. So there we go. Look how easy that was to blend those two exposures together. Now one thing that makes it easier to understand what's going on here is to actually see the mask that we're painting. And in the masking pane, there's an option called Show Mask. And from here, there's actually a couple different options to look at the mask. At the bottom is grayscale, and that's a typical grayscale mask, just like you would see on a layer mask in Photoshop. But there's also two other options, one called Overlay, which gives you a 50% red overlay over the area that's being masked, or there's an option called White, which puts a white overlay over everything. So it makes it easy for you to see where your mask is. It helps you clean up any flaws in it easier by being able to see what that mask looks like in real time. Just like that. That's how easy it is to do something like a sky replacement. There we go. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to show you another image here. But before I move out of here, I just want to make sure that nobody has any questions over what I've talked about so far.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
no,
that would be your cue.
I'm actually answering questions right now. If you want, though, Dan, either after this demo or now, it'd be interesting to show people who may not be Lightroom users how they can get their images into perfect layers outside of Lightroom.
Yeah, we can certainly show people how to do that, and we're using it through Lightroom today for our demos, but you can use it as a standalone, and you can also set it up as an external editor in just about any application that supports an external editor. So even though we don't have the plugin for Aperture today, you can still set it up and use it through Aperture or use it through iPhoto, or I think you could even use it through something like Capture NX. As long as the program lets you specify an external editor, you can just point it towards perfect layers, and you can use all these features with any program. All right, let me see. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to show you another example here. I'm just going to close and not save this. I'm going to go back to Lightroom. And for this example, we're going to talk about how to actually blend multiple lights together. Now, if you've a commercial photographer or you've worked in tabletop photography, you know that a lot of times when you photograph something that is small, especially jewelry or watches or things like that, it's very difficult to light such a small object. All the lights in your studio are designed to light big things like people and cars. So when it comes to lighting a very small thing, it can be difficult. So a trick that commercial photographers use is they turn off all the lights in their studio, and then they can work with one small light, and they just take multiple exposures pointed at different parts of the image, or highlighting different components, or even using small fill cards like a white index card that they can use as a fill card to light certain parts of an image. So I've basically done that here. We photographed a microphone in the onOne studio. And actually, believe it or not, rather than using fancy studio lights, this is all photographed with a simple flashlight. This is like a $3 AA flashlight you could get at the Home Depot. And all I did is turn the lights off, and then I just took 7 exposures with the light pointed at different parts of the scene. So we'll walk through what those different areas are, but first let's go ahead and merge this together into perfect layers. So I'm just going to take these 7 shots, and I'm going to go to Plugin Extras and send it to perfect layers. And again, it's going to merge all those together into one new layered Photoshop file. Here we go. And if we walk through the layers list, let's actually talk about what we've done here. I'm going to start by turning all of these layers off, except for the bottom 2 here. Now, if we look at the very bottom layer, what we've done is we've just aimed that flashlight towards the background. So you would just see a blue background behind it. Just happened to be the wall that was painted blue. Very simple. You could use a piece of blue paper or whatever you want for your background. The layer above that, the light is actually pointed at the side of the microphone. It's what we call a skip light or a side light. And it kind of adds a nice three-dimensional wraparound lighting quality to it. What we need to do is we want to merge the light from those two together. So the easy way to merge those together is using the blending modes. If you work in a completely dark studio, all we're trying to do is add light together. So by using the blending mode called lighten, it's going to take the lighter parts of each layer and just add them up on top of each other. So just by doing that, by changing that blending mode, we are able to take the two lights and combine them together. Now here's the really cool part. By adjusting the opacity of each layer, you can now control how strong each light source is. It's like being in the studio again, but you're doing it through the computer, which gives you ultimate flexibility and lets you create multiple versions for a client. You could have one that's a very flat lit version that you might use for a catalog, but then a more dynamic, more contrasty version that you might use on a website, for example. So let me show you what I mean. I'm just going to grab this opacity slider, and I'm just going to pull it to the left and then back to the right. And you can see how I can turn that strength of that light up or down just by adjusting its opacity. I'm going to leave this one up pretty high, and we're just going to repeat that process as we add each light source to the image. So I'm going to go up a layer and turn it on. Now in this shot, the light is aimed straight down towards the top of the microphone. You know, microphones have this cool metallic mesh on top of it. We kind of want to highlight that mesh and get a little sparkle on it. To blend it in, same thing, just change that blending mode to lighten, and there we go. It's added that bit of sparkle to the top of the microphone. Let me just turn the layer on or off so you can see what that did. Adds a little bit of sparkle. It also lights up the nut over here on the left-hand side. Let's keep going up the list. I'm going to add the next layer. This next layer is actually a main light. The light is aimed straight at the front of it. This is doing the majority of the work when it comes to lighting the microphone. We'll change that to lighten again. There we go. Now, in my taste, that's a little bit too sharp, or a little bit too bright, rather. I'm just going to bring that intensity down just by adjusting the opacity. There we go. That's coming along. Now, I don't have to do any alignment on this because all the images were shot on a tripod, so they're all automatically aligned for me. The next layer is a fill light. In this case, the light is very soft, and it is equally over the microphone. It's designed to help fill in some of the shadows. Change that blending mode to lighten. There we go. Let me turn it on and off so you can see what that does. It's a very subtle effect. It just adds a little bit of warmth to the shadows, adds a little bit of a highlight, a little diffuse specular highlight along the side of the microphone to help bring out the three-dimensional shape of the barrel. Let's go to the next layer. We're going to turn this one on. This one's a little odd. It's completely black. All we see is just a little red dot in the middle. If I turn this layer off, I'll explain what that is. In the middle of this microphone, there's normally a little red light right here when it has power to it. Now, if I had that light on for every shot that we photographed, then that bulb would get multiplied, and it would be this big white blob in the middle of the scene. We don't want that. We want it to look like it does naturally. The other problem is, in order to get that light on, the microphone has to be plugged in, which means it would have a cord hanging out of the bottom of it. Well, that cord would be pretty ugly in a photograph. So what we did is we just took one image with the cord plugged in to get the proper exposure for that red LED, and then unplugged it for the rest of them. So all we do, change that blending mode again to lighten, and now we've turned on the little light bulb, that little LED right there in the middle of the microphone. And then our last layer at the top, we'll talk about here in just a second. You know, at this point, this would be kind of a good hero shot. This would be something you would end up giving to a client. But the cool thing is, by being able to stack these layers together, you can create those different versions. So what I did is I did one more version with some diffusion over the camera lens. That means a little bit of like a soft focus filter. The cool thing about that is anything that's lit by the light source is going to become fuzzy and soft. We'll just change the blending mode to lighten. Now I've got a little bit of fuzz on top of the microphone. Now you noticed it looks like I bumped the camera. It's not quite aligned where it should be. You can see it's moved a little bit. I probably wiggled the camera when I was putting the diffusion filter on it. So I'm just going to use the move tool, select that layer, and now I can move that diffusion and line it up where it's supposed to be, just like that. And I can use the masking brush to remove any of that layer that I don't like. In this case, let me make my brush just a little bit smaller. And let's bring our opacity back up to 100. I'm just going to paint away this little bit of fuzz right here along the side of the microphone that I don't like, just like that. So there we go. There would be our finished version with that fuzz, or that little bit of glow, added to the top. And of course, when we save this file, if I go up to File and Save, it's going to send this back to Lightroom as a layered Photoshop file, where I can always just open it up again and continue working on it to make different versions. All right. Any questions out there, Brian?
There was one question that actually two different people asked within a second of each other, which I thought was interesting because it's a very specific question. The question is there a maximum number of images that you can import into perfect layers simultaneously?
That is a great question. I do not know of any limit that we have put into it. It's really going to be more a limit of how much RAM you have on your computer. I imagine at some point you'll probably run out of RAM and you won't be able to stick any more layers in there. But we've never actually pushed it to find out what that limit is, and it's going to depend on the size of the image in your computer.
Right. Fair. Yeah, it was I just found that's such a specific question, and for the frequency to be within seconds of each other, I got a kick out of that. Um, all right, I'm going to take control, and I'm going to show you guys one more image right now. Uh, so for those of you that may have been on our webinar yesterday on Perfect Layers, we showed you what we consider kind of like a motor drive sequence or somewhat of an animation of a roller coaster that I took. I took 4 different images of a roller coaster within fractions of a second of each other. And we made it so that on one image we had all 4 images kind of combined, so it looked like there were 4 cars on the track at once. Well, now I'm going to use one of Dan's images that he took, and you can see that we have this snowboarder. And as we scroll through the images, you can see the motion. You can also see, though, that Dan, he moved his camera because he was probably standing up without a tripod, and it's just natural that this happens. But what I want to do is I want to create kind of like a motor drive sequence. So we've got these 4 images, and they'll give the impression of motion. So I'm just going to select these 4 images, and I'm going to send them to Perfect Layers. Bypass my welcome dialog. And so here are our 4 images, and you can see as we turn them on and off that we've got them just like we would expect to. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I want to align these images. And a few people ask questions, is there an auto align? Right now, it's a manual align, and it's pretty easy to do. All you need to do is drop the opacity of the active layer, and you can see that there's a little bit of a shift. So I can just move my mouse to align. You can also use the arrow keys to move it on a kind of a finer pixel by pixel up and down. And I'm really only concerned with the alignment of the mountain range. Now, with my image aligned, those 2 layers, I'm going to bring the image back up, and I'm going to use the trim tool. I'm a really big fan of it. I'm just going to draw really tightly around the snowboarder. Now, after I make my selection, I can kind of move it around. I can also kind of just grab a corner and expand it a bit. And when I'm done, I'm going to hit enter. And what that trim tool does is it basically says, all right, I want to keep that whatever's in my selection and remove everything else. It's just a mask that you can control the size of. And with one key, it removes everything. Now, let's repeat the process. I'm going to go here to this image, drop the opacity, see that it's misaligned. So I'm just going to align it, kind of get it close. There we go. That's pretty perfectly aligned. Bring up the opacity. And again, just kind of draw from one corner. I like to get as tight as I can to my selection. Just expand this corner here just a tad. Hit enter. Here we go. Now we've got our 3rd image. And then finally repeat the process. Drop the opacity, and you see where I'm going with this. Just kind of get it so that it's aligned properly. There we go. And one more time. Opacity up, trim tool on, get the selection. And there we go. Now I want to show you something, just to show you what the versatility of Perfect Layers in your overall workflow. Now I'm just going to hit save here, It's going to overwrite the PSD file that's created. And we're not saying that you have to stop using Photoshop. That's not what we want to say at all. We've got our image here. Let's say you do want to do some finer edits with some tools that are in Photoshop. If you send the image to Photoshop, you see that you've got your layers here with the masks that you created. They're right over here. So if you need to do anything else, you can do it. The point is that the most common functionality that we find are people who want to combine layers or blend layers. And that's where Perfect Layers, is just, it wins in spades with the overall speed, with the amount of RAM that you save. Perfect Layers does not need as much of your system resources. So I'm just going to quit out of Photoshop here. And again, now that you've got your image, you can do anything that you wanted to do. You can convert it, say, to a black and white image if you wanted. Anything that you have at Lightroom, you can do. So Perfect Layers is kind of the beginning of my workflow now. Is if I want to blend these things, that's what I would do. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this. Actually, Dan, are there any questions? Does anyone want to see anything before I move on to finishing this up?
Let me take a look here. I was feverishly answering questions. There is a question about what if you wanted to save a TIFF file back to Lightroom, and we natively use Photoshop as our format because it stores the layers and the layer masks and all the blending options, so that way you can open it again and have access to all of those layers. Now, Photoshop has the ability to save a TIFF file that has layers, but only Photoshop can read those layered TIFF files. It's kind of a misnomer that you can then take those files to another application and access those layers. You can't actually do that. So that's the reason we work as our native format as a Photoshop file. It's going to be more, has a greater ability to be opened with more things being saved. Now you can export a TIFF or a JPEG that's a flattened version. That way you can still get to those formats if you want to. Just go to File and Export, as Brian's showing there on screen.
Yep, and you can choose where this goes. There were a few questions earlier as to where's the location of the PSD file that we create. So if you're in Lightroom, if you're quick enough, you'll see that if I'm in my grid view, and you can see how Perfect Layers did it again, as soon as you send any image to Perfect Layers, it will create a PSD file, and that will be the new base file that it will work on. And when you save, it'll just overwrite with whatever work you did in Perfect Layers. So let's say you're done and you don't need this one here, just reject it and delete it from the disk, or just remove it. But that's how it works. That's the great thing, though, is that it automatically is created in the working folder from where you send your images, and it's hot imported, so you don't have to look around for it or go hunting. And that's just kind of how we use Perfect Layers with Lightroom. Now, there is a way to use Perfect Layers if you're an Aperture user by setting Perfect Layers as an external editor. And I'm actually going to record a video offline that we'll post that will show you how to do that. Once the final version comes out, that will be moot. You won't need to. We'll fully support Aperture. So, Dan, is there anything else, or am I good to conclude?
I think you are good.
Excellent. All right, so let me just wrap things up with what we talked about today about Perfect Layers. And I want to kind of recap with these finer points because it's important. Just like I mentioned with the Aperture feature, not all of our features that we have planned are in the public preview release. The shipping version will have them. I didn't actually show you. Let me hide this. I'm going to really quickly just send an image to Perfect Layers because this is important. If you find a problem, something crashes, or you have a question about Perfect Layers specifically, from the application itself, if you go to the Help menu button and you go to Provide Feedback, this will launch an email, your default email product. I don't know why it's going to. Oh, it goes here. I thought it launched our email, but you can do it right here from Contact Us. There we go. I must have had an older build previously, but we used to have this automatically launch an email. It'll bring you to the website, which is actually even better because you have right away the features that are not in it yet, but that are coming. So if you want to get a preview, it also gives you what some of our known issues are. And if there's still something that you're just not able to launch, hit this link here. This is what will launch your email product. It'll be addressed to us with the proper subject line. All right, back to Keynote. So if you do find those bugs, let us know via your feedback. This release expires on June 30th, 2011, just in time for you to go enjoy the summer. And if you want, go to onOneSoftware.com. Dan and I recorded a bunch of really cool videos that show the different use cases of perfect layers. If for some reason you have not yet gotten perfect layers, go and get it. It's free. Go to onOneSoftware.com. You'll see it. It's prominently displayed. You can download it for free and use it. Today's the last webinar for this week. Next week, though, we have a really, really awesome lineup of webinars with our masters and friends of onOne. We're calling it the Perfect Layers All-Star Week. RC Concepcion, Dave Cross, Frank Salas, Seth Resnick, they will all be doing Perfect Layers exclusive webinars for us to show you how they use Perfect Layers. Because I'm sure you guys are bored of hearing from us. We want you to see some of the biggest names in photography and how they use this product. So go to onOneSoftware.com/webinars and register for those. I just saw a question as to where you can view yesterday's webinar. It's not on the first bullet point. It's not there yet. The bottom two, you can view it. The iTunes podcast channel. If you launch iTunes and search for onOne University from the iTunes store, you will get our podcast channel for free. And you can also go to our YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/onOne University. And those videos are on there right now. This is my email address. By all means, email me if either Dan or I missed your question. Feel free to email me, and we'll be glad to get back to you. Also, we're on Facebook and Twitter, so we welcome you to follow us there. We put a lot of good information on each of our social media channels, so by following us, you'll ensure that you stay up to date with everything. So Dan, on behalf of Dan, actually, I'll just say thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week at our All-Star webinars. Have a great weekend, and or happy holidays to everyone who celebrates, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, Dan, for your help too.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.